extraordinary vessels are the channels which circulate the Jing. They also regulate the qi, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But where are the extraordinary vessels in the body? Well, if those of you who know the 12 meridians, you might realise that there are some quite important organs in the body that don't have a meridian. Most important being the brain and the reproductive organs. And so in all that I've talked about in terms of the Jing, growth, development, fertility, reproduction, of course the reproductive organs are quite important for that. And of course the brain. Because if we think of cycles of energy, 7 and 8 year cycles that I've just been describing, when we think of Western view of that, that's changes in the neuroendocrine system, so the hormonal system, which is linked to regulation from the brain, the pituitary, the hypothalamus. So we can straight away see, this is what the Jing is, this is what the Chinese are talking about, this connection between the brain and the reproductive system. I'm going to talk more about women's reproductive system, as I already did with the 7 year cycles, because it's a bit clearer and more obvious in women. But of course, male reproductive organs, men have extraordinary vessels, and it relates to the male reproductive organs. So what we have to think of is these meridians, and these organs, the brain and the reproductive organs, are so fundamental that they don't just have one channel, like lung has one meridian, they have 8 that regulate them, and especially what I call the core 4, which I've already talked about a bit, the Du, Ren, Chong and Dai, governing, conception, penetrating and girdle vessel. So brain, reproductive organs. The other important organ for the extraordinary vessels is the kidneys, or are the kidneys. Kidneys are in the 12 meridian system, but kidneys are in Chinese medicine where the Jing is said to be stored. And when we talking about kidneys in Chinese medicine in relation to the Jing, we're talking about the energetic kidneys, which are actually a bit lower than our physical kidneys. So our physical organs of the kidneys under the ribs, the energetic zone is much more below the ribs and basically the lumbar area, the lower back. And within this area, there's a very important point called Ming Men, or the gate of vitality, which lies between the 2nd and the 3rd lumbar vertebrae. And the Chinese refer to this as the gate of origin, where they'd say our energy arises, that moment of the egg and the sperm coming together, a spark of energy, the arising of our energy in our human body, Ming Men. So one of the most important points. Corresponding point on the front, the Dantian, which is also on the midline below the navel. So what we're now beginning to see is that this is very much a midline energy. So where these vessels flow is starting with the midline and making a link between the brain and the reproductive organs. And Ming Men, the space between the kidneys. Space is also quite an important aspect. It's that meeting point, energy arises and then moves out into the rest of the body. So gate of vitality, where energy is coming into the body. So then the pathways of the extraordinary vessels physically in the body are linking the brain, the kidneys and the uterus, or the reproductive organs, and they're said to have these internal connections, but externally to arise on the body at the level of the perineum. Acupuncturists do sometimes put needles in the perineum. When we work with shiatsu, we don't physically touch the perineum, but working points on the extraordinary vessels will influence the perineum. So the core energies are from the centre, arising on the perineum, and we have midline, front and back, going really between the anus and the mouth. And the midline of the front is one vessel, and the midline of the back is another, and they arise on the perineum and they finish at the mouth, and then they enter into the brain. And this basic core are what we call the conception vessel and the governing vessel. And if we think about when we're in the womb, we're curled over, the front of our body is in fact more yin because it's on the inside. The front is our inside, it's the area we tend to protect a bit more. The back is the outside, more protecting, that's the governing vessel, and that's the yang. So therefore we say that conception vessel is the sea of yin, and it's going to regulate all the yin energies in the body. And the governing vessel is the sea of yang, and it will regulate all the yang energies in the body, as well as the jing. So in fact, these extraordinary vessels are quite complex because they're not only regulating the jing, they are also overall regulators of the qi. They are the most fundamental vessels in the body because they're there before we actually form our organs. They're there really right from the moment of conception. At the moment of conception, we're going to create not the egg, the fertilised egg, will create not just our physical body, but our support structures of the placenta and the fetal membranes. And we're also going to create our amniotic sac and our umbilical cord. So we can say that extraordinary vessels, yes, the physical pathway is in our body, but they relate to outside our body as well. And in terms of embryological development, actually, we go through a whole process of forming, of folding over, and then we start off as a bilaminar disc, and I'm going to go through this in another talk on embryology, but we start off more flat and then we curl around. So the relationships between them change. And so they're actually quite complex. It's very debated within Chinese medicine, what's the direction of governing vessel and conception vessel? For me, understanding embryology, it's complex. It's more of a spiralling movement. So there's a movement up and there's a movement down, but we can say where we start from is in the centre and then the energy moves out. But then it has to come back to the centre. So there's this spiralling movement, which are the extraordinary vessels. That's conception vessel and governing vessel, sea of yin and sea of yang. But as the egg and the sperm come together, a third energy is produced. And this we could say is a bit like the spark of us. Who are we who is different from our mother and our father? We have our connection to the ancestral line, but we're also different. We're not the same as our mother and our father, and we don't have to repeat the patterns that they repeated. We're different. And this is very much the energy of us and relates, Chinese medicine, our heart relates to, of course, it has a link with Western medicine and the blood and heart and love and that whole nourishing quality. But it's very much related to our individuality, our Shen. Who are we who are individual, and what is our individual journey in life? That's the Shen, and that's the energy of the penetrating vessel that's different. So as between the yin and the yang, the mother and the father, there's me. And the penetrating vessel is a more complex vessel. I'm going to describe that in more detail. But it basically lies each side of the conception vessel, but it also links back up to Ming Men. So it lies between the governing vessel and the conception vessel. It also has a very important branch going down the legs, which is about anchoring us and bringing us to earth. So that's very much us landing and arriving on earth. That's the energy of the penetrating vessel, or the Chong Mai. And then the fourth of these core four is the link between the kidneys and the reproductive organs that goes around in a horizontal way, and this is called the girdle vessel. And it is very much like a girdle that goes around, but it also goes underneath. And so these are what I call the core four. They're the energies of the midline, and they regulate the jing and also the qi. Then there's a secondary four, which are called the linking and the heel vessels. So how we can see these are that once we've anchored to earth, then we start to take energy from the earth back into our body. So that relates to the heel vessels. How do we land on the earth? How do we step on the earth? They're the ones that bring the energy from the outside back into our body in a very fundamental way. And then the linking are very much about how we bring the energy of the heaven. They relate to our hands and arms and how we bring the heaven energy into our body. And the heel and the linking together bring the more outer energy back in. And they relate very much, in fact, to our hips and our shoulders. A lot of the points are around here because it's then we bring our energy back in to the core four. And so those are the 8 extraordinary vessels. They regulate the Jing, but they're overall regulators of Qi. They form before the 12 meridians. They're the most fundamental in terms of how we relate to heaven and how we relate to earth.